Hi everybody, Chris here. Happy New Year. Today I'll be doing a book review for A Guide to the Good Life by William Irvine. And sorry, the full title was A Guide to the Good Life, The Ancient Art of Stoic Joy. And as the full title suggests, this book is Irvine's guide to the Stoic philosophy of how to live your life well and how to achieve the good life and tranquility. And Irvine does, I think, an excellent job of 1, describing Stoicism, 2, defending Stoicism, and 3, making Stoicism accessible in a guide to sort of someone who doesn't want to riff through a bunch of primary sources with old language and maybe that might be a little unfamiliar, such as reading Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius. I think that this guide is a really good modern source. And that can be said of a few other modern sources I've read on Stoicism, but I really particularly like Irvine's A Guide to the Good Life. So this is a good way to start if you're interested in Stoicism, and if you're very familiar with Stoic philosophy, and maybe have read other Stoic books, such as I have when I picked up Irvine. It's still definitely worth reading. There's stuff in here that you'll take away that you either didn't know about Stoicism, or you knew, but you'll look at it in a slightly different way because of the way that Irvine frames Stoic philosophy. So Irvine sets up his book into essentially 4 parts, I believe. And the first part gives a brief history of Stoicism from Greece to Rome, and then the second part gives psychological techniques of Stoicism. And this was really my favorite part of the book. And in this part of the book, he talks about in very simple modern language the different techniques that the Stoics argued for and would use in order to be happy and make their life happy. Which actually I should explain before I talk somewhat about the psychological techniques that Irvine talks about, that he does a great job of defending Stoicism in the sense that Stoicism is often mischaracterized into a straw man, where Stoic philosophy makes people into a cold, uncalculated robot who doesn't feel emotion, maybe maybe not the best person to be around, the most joyful person. Whereas Irvine points out that that isn't really true, and that if you actually go back to Stoic philosophy, one of their main virtues was joy. And it's not about suppressing emotion and not showing any emotion, as much as it is about understanding emotions versus reason, keeping emotions in check, limiting negative emotions, trying to prevent negative emotions from occurring, and then also when negative emotions do occur, then you want to mitigate them and stop them, basically. So the Stoics aren't against emotion. They're all for positive emotion, and they're certainly for reason, which is probably where they get that mischaracterization as being emotionless. And they do advocate, obviously, for mitigating negative emotions. So I think Irvine pointing that out, while it might seem obvious, is really great, because, like I said, I've read a lot of Stoicism, and I kind of had this, not a feeling so much as I guess it could be called a feeling. When I was reading Stoicism before Irvine, and I knew the sort of textbook definition of Stoicism as being unemotionalist, I knew that those two things didn't align. The Stoicism that I was reading and learning about in philosophy wasn't a one-to-one with the sort of lexical use of the term Stoicism. But I couldn't quite put my finger on where the distinction lied. In fact, I even sort of understood why that mischaracterization existed because of the rationalistic nature of Stoicism, even though I knew it was still a mischaracterization. But I think Irvine does a great job of sort of identifying the obvious, which is that the Stoics aren't against, like I said, I'm not going to repeat it a bunch of times, but Stoics aren't against emotion. Which after reading that, I'm like, oh, that's so obvious. I already knew that, but I just needed, Irvine to sort of lay it out there and defend Stoicism in that way. And it clicked. I was like, oh, that makes sense. And there's a lot of those moments, too, in this book, because of the way that Irvine describes Stoicism and Stoicism psychological techniques, that for someone who has read sort of the more traditional Stoic texts, you'll like I said, you'll understand them in a different way, and it'll click where you're like, oh, okay, that's how I can maybe apply this ancient Stoic technique more to my everyday life in a modern context. So talking about some of those Stoic techniques, he talks about obviously the economy of control, which I would argue is a primary axiom or first principle of Stoicism, which is that there are things that you aren't in control of, and that there are things you are in control of, and that you should only focus on the things that you are in control of. And Irvine does two things. The first thing is he goes into more detail on what that means and, like I said, modernizes a little bit. And I think that is good. I think that the job that Irvine does there is valid. And basically he makes the point that there are actually three things and not two, although there are two primary. There's sort of a sub-distinction, which is really where we want to focus, and that there are things over which we have complete control. There are things over which we have no control over. Those are the two main Stoic traditional things. But then there's also things over which we have some but not complete control. And that's most things. And then he says that with the things that we have complete control over, we should concern ourselves with those things. With things that we don't have control over, we should not concern ourselves with those things. Both of those pieces of advice being traditional Stoicism. And then over the things which we have some but not complete control over, he says, we should concern ourselves with these things, but we should be careful to internalize the goals we form with respect to them. Which the internalization of goals was one of the prior psychological techniques in the book, where you want your goals to be, if I'm playing a game of chess, say, the externalized goal would be to win the game, which I have some control over but not complete control over. Whereas the internalized goal is to do well and to have fun, something along those lines, or to maybe improve my chess understanding or game. And then as long as we have internalized goals, we won't be as damaged by the potential outcome being not in our favor, since we don't have complete control. And some of the other psychological techniques. The second thing that he does with that classic Stoic first principle is somewhat of a criticism. I don't think Irvine, although he does go into great depth, and like I said, he sort of edits it and gives it a modern touch, I still don't think that Irvine places that first principle, the dichotomy of control, I don't think he gives it the central role in Stoicism that it sort of should have, and that it sort of needs and sort of has traditionally held. I think that's really my only criticism of this book, and it's kind of nitpicky, but I do think that, like I said, Irvine is he sort of places it on the same level as some of the other psychological techniques, when really the other psychological techniques are deduced from that first principle of the economy of control. To give you an example, the idea of negative visualization. The idea that maybe, this book ripped while I was reading it. Maybe this whole book could rip. Maybe I'll spill some coffee on it. If that happens, because of how much I like this book and because I paid for it and all that, and I highlighted in it somewhat, I'll be very annoyed and mad and angry if that happens, if it's destroyed in some manner. But if I think about it beforehand, and I sort of visualize the negative outcomes of what could possibly happen to this book, then if anything actually does happen, I won't be as sad about it. And this, at least one example from the classical text I know is from Epictetus, who talks about this with a vase. Imagine, that this vase is broken every day, and then he says, do the same thing for your wife and daughter, basically. But that negative visualization psychological technique is deduced from the idea that we don't have complete control over I don't have complete control over the future of this book. As much as I'll try to keep it on my shelf and make sure nothing happens to it, there could be a fire, maybe, like I said, maybe I'll spill some coffee on it by accident. It's not completely within my control, and therefore I shouldn't worry about if something happens to it. I shouldn't worry about if a coffee spills on it, then it's something I couldn't control. Oh well. The negative visualization stems from that prior, more axiomatic dichotomy of control idea. So anyways, that's one of my only criticisms of Irvine, is that he needs to re-centralize the dichotomy of control. And I just told you about negative visualization, even though I can't pronounce it. That is one of my favorite techniques in the books, and I think it's Irving's actually, because he keeps going back to that. I also liked even more the negative visualization, which I was already familiar with, was something that I haven't read about in any Stoicism until Irving, which is projective visualization. In other words, project something that is bad that could happen to you onto someone else, and then ask yourself how you would respond to that thing, to that event happening with somebody else. To give you an example, let's say I'm trying to decide let's say I have a death in the family, God forbid, and I'm grieving over it, and I'm thinking about the dichotomy of control, like I couldn't control it, and it's still my Stoic rationalization still isn't mitigating my grief too much. One thing I could do is I could project sort of visualization on thinking about what if my friend, what if the situation befell one of my best friends? What if, his whatever dies, and then what advice would I give him? How would I console him? How would I want, even if I wouldn't tell him, how would I want him to act? How would I want him to grieve properly? And then by projecting that onto some other, I can better grieve myself and have proper emotion grieving. Doesn't to say that I should be unemotional while grieving. It's just to say that I shouldn't have any negative emotion by grieving in excess or by anger, stuff like that. Oops. And then he goes, like I said, he goes on to do a bunch of other psychological techniques, one of which is self-denial. So maybe rather than just visualizing losing something, I'll also practice not being with it. A classic example of this is the ancient Stoics saying, sometimes you need to sort of live a more Spartan lifestyle, maybe a more aesthetic lifestyle. So like maybe walk without your shoes sometimes, or maybe don't always eat steak dinners. Like kind of eat at the minimum, so that if you ever need the minimum, you'll not be as harmed as if you had lived luxuriously. An example of this would be, let's say I win the lottery. A Stoic would say that I shouldn't really change my lifestyle too much, if at all, even though that's easier said than done. I shouldn't try to splurge and change my lifestyle too much, because I should stay comfortable not having that money, so that if I ever do lose the money, that lifestyle change wouldn't be so much of a change. Whereas if I go from really high to really low, that would be somewhat traumatic. So I'm not going to describe all of the different psychological techniques, especially because I can't do nowhere near as well of a job as Irving can. But they are very great. Not only are they great psychological techniques from the Stoics, but which can be found in Irving's book, but Irving also does a particularly excellent job of describing them and of communicating them in a very simple manner. I think that's about all I had to say about Irving's book. In terms of a rating, I think I am going to give it a 5 out of 5. I'm trying not to give so many books a 5 out of 5s because I do it somewhat often, but this book really deserves it. This is an excellent resource for someone looking to Stoicism. So, William Irvine's A Guide to the Good Life, 5 out of 5. Thank you for watching.